When the poet Louis Zukofsky guest-edited the February 1931 edition of Poetry magazine, he spearheaded a collection of works written by his closest friends and collaborators, little knowing that the collection would be the foundation for a poetic movement that would send shockwaves throughout the literary community for years to come. This movement would come to be known as Objectivism. Building off a foundation built by Imagism, Objectivist poets were particularly interested in the pure presentation of objects, placing emphasis not on abstract and emotional ideas, but on the pure reactions readers have to the objects themselves. They desired for readers to forge their own relationships with the objects they showcased in their poems, therefore creating a genuine emotional response unclouded by personal trappings or beliefs. That evocation of emotion that objects provide is for the Objectivists an ultimate truth. While the nature of their art is well defined, those associated with the movement often debated whether or not it was even a movement at all, and as a result, the movement's influence has shifted over the years. This evolution can be seen through the individual collections of poets from the days of Zukofsky onward, where their adherence to and/or protest of Objectivist poetics as well as praxis progressed. A natural starting point for the examination of the movement's evolution is the work of William Carlos Williams, one of the earliest poets of the movement who is often considered its premier figure. Williams was arguably one of, if not the most faithful to the primary tenets of the Objectivist movement. His ultimate literary goal was to capture profundity in everyday life, and Objectivism's affection for objects and the relationship they inspired was a more than suitable method for Williams to achieve such goals. Striving to accept and embrace the mundanity of life, rather than cash in on the sentimentality that he considered to be the mundanity of writing, Williams abandoned personality in pure pursuit of his art. A stanza from his culminating final work, Paterson, perhaps best encompasses his passion for Objectivism.
Say it. No ideas but in things. Nothing but the blank faces of the houses and cylindrical trees, bent, forked by preconception and accident, split, furrowed, creased, mottled, stained, secret, into the body of the light.
This strong passion for the emotionality and purity of objects is what made Williams so adherent to the poetics and praxis of Objectivism. While focus on this passion typically lies upon the content of his works, it can even be witnessed in its peculiar forms. Even though they follow no preset rhyme scheme or meter, there is a musical pace to his works that further enlightens and informs the locality and rawness of the objects he strives to embolden. If there is any word Williams would choose as important in my description of his poetic practice, it would be one I just said: locality. The idea of local history and color working as a guide through which the objects he presents, and by extension himself, can find a place in space and time, is an idea that would prove fundamental to not only his career, but to the works of many who came after him. While some academics choose to place Williams more as a modernist poet than as an objectivist one, it's Williams' rootedness in this idea of locality that breaks the boundary of that classification. This is most clear in his autobiography, where he notes a particular aversion to the distance found in newly revered modernist T.S. Eliot's work, The Wasteland. I felt at once that it had set me back 20 years, and I'm sure it did. Critically, Eliot returned us to the classroom just at the moment when I felt we were on a point to escape to matters much closer to the essence of a new art form itself, rooted in the locality which should give it fruit. Author Jim Cocola's book, Places in the Making, A Cultural Geography of American Poetry, he describes that the locality of Williams was anterior to poetry and stood as a paramount concern, positioning the emplacement of knowledge as a precondition for the embodiment of knowledge. Williams' attempts to articulate this sense of locality can be seen throughout his considerable body of work, with his opus Paterson being the highlight of that poetic quest, an epic poem inspired by the New Jersey area in which he spent almost the entirety of his life. Williams captures the unspeakable in the description of local surroundings.
Paterson lies in the valley under the Passaic Falls, its spent waters forming the outline of his back. He lies on his right side, head near the thunder of the waters filling his dreams. Eternally asleep, his dreams walk about the city, where he persists incognito. Butterflies settle on his stone ear. Immortal, he neither moves nor rouses, and is seldom seen, though he breathes, and the subtleties of his machinations, drawing their substance from the noise of the pouring river, animate 1,000 automatons.
An earlier work of Williams, Spring and All, also marvelously achieves this quest.
By the road to the contagious hospital, under the surge of the blue, mottled clouds driven from the northeast, a cold wind. Beyond, the waste of broad, muddy fields, brown with dried weeds, standing and fallen. Patches of standing water, the scattering of tall trees. All along the road, the reddish, purplish, forked, upstanding, twiggy stuff of bushes and small trees, with dead, brown leaves under them, leafless vines. Lifeless in appearance, sluggish, dazed spring approaches. They enter the new world naked, cold, uncertain of all, save that they enter. All about them the cold, familiar wind. Now the grass, tomorrow the stiff curl of wild carrot leaf. One by one, objects are defined. It quickens, clarity, outline of leaf. But now the stark dignity of entrance. Still, the profound change has come upon them. Rooted, they grip down and begin to awaken.
In the era after Williams, the idea of locality became a focal point of both admiration and contention for poets associated with the Objectivist movements. Three poets in particular had interesting takes on this idea: George Oppen, Lorine Niedecker, and William Bronk. For Oppen, locality was a subject of interest, but without the passion for it as Williams had. This is most apparent in his seminal poem of Being Numerous No. 3, where he writes, "The emotions are engaged. Entering the city, as entering any city, we are not coeval with the locality, but we imagine others are. We encounter them. Actually, a populace flows through the city. This is a language, therefore, of New York." In her essay on Oppen entitled The Shipwreck of the Singular, writer Marjorie Perloff explores this poem through the lens of locality. Whereas Williams used locality as a baseline for his works, seeing it as essential to creating a metaphysical space in his work, Oppen saw a superficiality in the idea that simultaneously bothered and intrigued him. Perloff writes of this, "The city never comes into focus. Rather, the poet keeps his distance. Word choice is revealing. Coeval with, not part of, coeval with not Brooklyn Heights or Second Avenue, but with a locality. And the inhabitants of this locality remain faceless and nameless. They are others, them, a populace." Oppen, in contrast, cares little about New York and its characteristic images, but a great deal about the phenomenology of the mind. Oppen himself described his aversion to locality in an interview with Reinhold Schiffer, stating, "I have no theory of a need for a locality at all. It would rather frighten me to be too dependent on a locality, and it was nowhere in our spirit." Contrastly, Lorine Niedecker has often been classified as a locality or place poet. However, her take on the exploration of locality had a much more personal take, one tightly bound to the aesthetic of the self. This was of course rebellion against the objectivist with which she was so frequently associated. Her poem Pien to Place is perhaps the finest example of locality in action in her works. "And the place was water. Fish, fowl, flood, water lily mud, my life, in the leaves and on water, my mother and I, born, in swale and swamp and sworn to water, my father, through marsh fog, sculled down from high ground, saw her face, at the organ, bore the weight of lake water, and the cold, he signed for carp to be sold, that their daughter might go high on land, to learn, saw his wife turn deaf and away, she who knew boats and ropes no longer played." While her classification as a poet of locality has often defined scholarly analysis of her work, Niedecker in fact was grasping for something deeper than just place in her poetry. In her essay And Silence, Lorine Niedecker and the Life of Poetry, scholar Lorna Jowett highlights how critics have used Niedecker's use of locality against her, dismissing her at times as a simple small-town poet, despite praise from male writers like Williams who used the same techniques. This obscures the truth that Niedecker in fact uses locality to explore the politics of life on a profound level. Another poet of the Williams era, William Bronk, uses locality as a means to extend the meaning of the idea beyond its confines. Through his poem Local Landscapes, Bronk explores this breaking of boundaries. "The referent of worldly qualities, by which I mean the goods of this world, whether it be beauty of body, keenness of mind, or any grace whatever, besides, is not to this world, but to somewhere else, unaffected by qualities or acts of them, deaf-mute, sufficient to itself. For a little time the world, at least, responds to worldly qualities, cleverness, invention, bolds and graces of various kinds. Before their collapses happen, they make us think the world's mechanisms will carry us. We have the idea of homeland, as others before and after, or in other worlds. I have loved my native places, as if, without them, I should be lost, having no real place. But our homes are contrivances, coverings for emptiness. Our local landscapes acknowledge our unarrival, our brochures of desire and postcards from there. They tour in untraveled space. He separates space and place through language, allowing them to operate independently from one another. For Bronk, place is the concrete world from which he feels alienated. His connection to the world is through locality, which beckons to a space beyond our personal boundaries. The local touches an untraveled space, a freedom from the contrivances of modernity. It is connected to a greater, unassuming nature that in turn is far greater than what we've come to know. It anchors Bronk, but also serves as a reminder that there is untraveled space beyond. Bronk's movement beyond is what brings us to the current state of locality, which can be exemplified by the poet Susan Howe. As a shining example of the culmination of decades of poetic exploration by both herself and the many poets she admires, Howe captures locality in all its complex beauty and infinite possibility. Her early poem Thorow, an example of which is pictured here, exemplifies a locality that has broken free from its boundaries to create an exploration of broader topics. In this case, rather than objectify the locality, she gives it a voice, allowing the native peoples of the Lake George area she explores to finally speak out, creating an honest and emotional history. That transcendence is what allows the idea of locality to lie on a poetic device that captures the soul of the postmodern aesthetic. It allows locality to be what author Benzi Zhang describes as non-limited locality, an idea capable of transcending cultural and longitudinal boundaries. To conclude this work, I leave you with poignant words from Zhang himself. Locality, as a result, no longer merely means temporal or spatial limits, but rather it represents a regressive transposition. In order to grasp here and now, we must be there and then. Through access to the other side, we are able to reconfront and redefine this side of ourselves.